What if a single question, just one, could expose the fault lines of an entire geopolitical conflict? Not missiles, not sanctions, not speeches, but a question asked directly to a sitting president: would you step down to save your country? That moment unfolded during a rare, high-profile international interview with Miguel Díaz-Canel, conducted by a foreign journalist in Havana, at a time when global attention was beginning to refocus on Cuba's deepening crisis. The setting was controlled, formal, and politically charged, an official conversation designed to project stability, but the tone shifted the instant that question was introduced. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't diplomatic, it cut straight into the core of the debate that has defined Cuba's relationship with the outside world for decades. What followed wasn't just an answer, it was a confrontation between two visions of power, sovereignty, and responsibility, revealing how even a single question can challenge not just a leader, but an entire system under pressure. Because today, Cuba is not just facing another crisis, it is facing a convergence of pressures unlike anything seen in decades. Across the island, the lights go out for hours at a time. Entire neighborhoods sit in darkness, not for minutes, but for nights. Fuel shortages have paralyzed transportation, leaving people stranded, businesses frozen, and daily life reduced to survival mode. Hospitals struggle, food lines grow longer, and frustration, quiet for years, is becoming harder to contain. And as thousands continue to leave the island in one of the largest migration waves in recent history, the question is no longer just about economics, it's about leadership. But before we go deeper into what this really means, subscribe to Cuba Explained, leave a like, and be part of this journey. Because the reality shaping Cuba today isn't just history, it's something the world is still trying to understand. When the journalist asked Díaz-Canel whether he would consider stepping down if it meant saving Cuba, the room shifted. His response was immediate, almost defiant. He didn't just reject the premise, he challenged the legitimacy of the question itself. Have you asked that to any other president in the world? He pushed back, reframing the conversation entirely. To him, this wasn't about personal leadership failure, it was about sovereignty. He insisted that Cuba is not governed by external mandates, especially not from the United States. The implication was clear. The question itself, in his view, wasn't neutral. It carried the weight of decades of tension, sanctions, and political pressure. And in that moment, the leadership question became something bigger. It became a symbol of the unresolved conflict between Cuba and the United States. But outside that interview room, reality tells a more complex story. Cuba's economic crisis today is not just the result of one factor. Yes, decades of U.S. sanctions have limited access to global markets and financial systems, but internal inefficiencies, currency reforms that destabilize purchasing power, and a heavy dependence on imports have created a fragile system, one that is now cracking under global pressures. Tourism, once a lifeline, has struggled to fully recover. Fuel imports have become inconsistent, partly due to shifting alliances and global energy instability. And while Cuba maintains ties with countries like Russia, Venezuela, and even China, those relationships are evolving, not always in ways that guarantee stability. Venezuela, once a critical oil supplier, is facing its own crisis. Russia, increasingly focused on its geopolitical priorities elsewhere, cannot fully replace what Cuba has lost. So when Díaz-Canel speaks about sovereignty, he is speaking from a long-standing position rooted in Cuba's revolutionary identity. But when ordinary Cubans wait in line for hours just to buy basic food, or when families decide to risk everything to leave the island, the conversation shifts. It becomes less about ideology and more about survival. And this is where the tension deepens. Because for many inside Cuba, the question is not whether leadership should be dictated by the United States, but whether the current system can adapt fast enough to prevent further collapse. Meanwhile, in Washington, the situation is viewed through a different lens. The United States has long framed its policies toward Cuba around political change, democracy, and human rights. But critics argue that these policies, especially the embargo, have contributed significantly to the hardships faced by the Cuban population. This creates a paradox. Pressure intended to promote change may also be reinforcing the very conditions that make change more difficult. And as migration numbers rise, the issue is no longer contained within Cuba's borders. It becomes a regional challenge, affecting countries across Latin America and even the southern border of the United States. This is why the moment in that interview matters, because it reveals a deeper truth. The leadership question is not just about one man stepping down. It is about who gets to define the future of a nation. Is it internal will, external pressure, or some combination of both? Díaz-Canel's insistence that Cuban leaders are chosen through their own system and not by foreign influence highlights a fundamental divide. But it also raises uncomfortable questions. If leadership is truly rooted in the people, why are so many people choosing to leave? And if external pressure is the primary cause of the crisis, why has internal reform struggled to deliver relief? from a broader analytical perspective, this exchange also exposes how narratives are constructed on both sides. For the Cuban government, emphasizing sovereignty reinforces legitimacy and resistance. For the United States, focusing on leadership change reinforces its long-standing foreign policy framework. But both narratives often collide with the lived reality of the Cuban people, who exist in the space between geopolitics and daily survival. This gap between narrative and reality is where the crisis becomes most visible and most dangerous, because it limits the ability of either side to fully address the complexity of the situation. As the crisis continues, Cuba is entering a new phase, one where its geopolitical role is quietly shifting. For years, it was seen primarily through the lens of Cold War history, a symbol of resistance against US influence. But today, it sits at the intersection of modern global tensions. Its relationships with Russia and China are not just ideological, they are strategic. Its migration crisis is not just humanitarian, it is geopolitical, and its internal struggles are no longer isolated. They ripple outward, influencing regional stability and international discourse. And here's the twist. The question that seems so direct, would you step down to save Cuba, may not actually have a simple answer. Because stepping down doesn't automatically solve systemic issues. And staying in power doesn't automatically mean resisting change. The real question may be whether the system itself can evolve fast enough to respond to the realities of today's world. In that sense, the leadership question becomes less about one individual and more about an entire structure under pressure. So as Cuba navigates blackouts, shortages, and an uncertain future, the world watches, not just to see what happens next, but to understand what it means. Because this is no longer just a story about Cuba. It's a story about how nations adapt, how power is challenged, and how global dynamics shape local realities. And in the end, the question lingers, not just for Díaz-Canel, not just for Cuba, but for anyone watching from the outside. When a country reaches a breaking point, who really holds the power to change its course? And what are they willing to risk to do it?